Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, sunlight cutting through your curtains, and you make a decision, a quiet, almost defiant one. Today is the day you stop eating sugar. No syrup in your coffee, no pastry on the way to work, no spoonful of ice cream at midnight to soften the edges of a hard day. Just you, your willpower, and whatever your body is about to put you through.
For the first hour or two, it feels easy, almost empowering. You feel in control, maybe even proud of yourself. But then something shifts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your mind starts to drift towards sweetness. Not aggressively, not yet, but like a song you can't unhear, sugar is suddenly everywhere in your thoughts. You smell it in the air, you think about it at your desk. You walk past a bakery and your feet slow down before your brain even registers why. Most people, when they decide to quit sugar, believe they're making a dietary change. They think it's about calories or inflammation or weight. And yes, those things matter. But what nobody tells you, what the research has only recently begun to illuminate, is that quitting sugar is first and foremost a neurological event. A war fought not in your stomach, but behind your eyes, inside the very circuitry that makes you who you are. The sugar you've been eating your entire life hasn't just been feeding your body, it's been training your brain. Every spoonful, every sip, every late-night handful of something sweet has been reinforcing neural pathways, automatic, deeply grooved signals that fire at certain hours, in certain moods, under certain conditions. And when you take sugar away, those pathways don't simply go quiet, they scream. Within the first 24 hours, something measurable begins happening inside your brain. Dopamine, the chemical your brain releases in response to pleasure, starts to drop. Dopamine is often called the brain's reward molecule, but that description barely captures what it actually does. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure, it's about anticipation. It's the feeling of reaching for something you love. It's the warmth of comfort, the sense that everything is going to be okay. Sugar, every single time you eat it, triggers a dopamine release inside a structure called the nucleus accumbens, the brain's deepest reward center. And when that release stops coming, your brain doesn't just miss the sugar, it mourns it. This is the first revelation that science offers about what happens when you quit. The initial suffering isn't physical hunger. You're not starving. Your body has plenty of stored energy. What you're experiencing in those first raw hours is withdrawal, real, measurable, neurochemical withdrawal. The same kind of process that happens with substances far more stigmatized than a bowl of cereal or a can of soda. Here's something worth sitting with. Every time you eat sugar, your brain activates the same reward circuitry that responds to cocaine and nicotine. Not in a loosely metaphorical way, in a precise, documented, neuroimaging confirmed way. The nucleus accumbens doesn't distinguish between a dopamine spike from a drug and a dopamine spike from a piece of chocolate cake. It just registers, this feels good, do this again. And it files that instruction deep where logic can't easily reach it.
Studies have shown that with repeated sugar consumption, the brain adapts the way it adapts to any repeated stimulant. It downregulates. It builds tolerance. It quietly reduces the number of dopamine receptors because there's been so much dopamine flooding the system that the brain, in its elegant self-regulation, tries to restore balance. The terrible consequence of this is that you need more sugar to feel the same satisfaction you once got from less. And when you don't get it, you feel worse than you did before you even started. This is not a character flaw. This is chemistry. And understanding it is what separates people who successfully quit from people who blame themselves for failing. By the third day, things get harder. Not quieter, harder. Your brain, deprived of its most reliable source of dopamine, begins to panic in the only way a brain can, It floods your thoughts with cravings. It makes everything that once seemed manageable feel suddenly irritating. You snap at people you love for reasons you can't quite explain. The lights seem too bright. The day seems too long. Your concentration frays at the edges, and by afternoon, you feel a kind of heaviness that isn't quite sadness, but isn't far from it either. Scientists call this phase neurochemical adaptation. What's happening at the cellular level is that your brain's dopaminergic system, the entire architecture of how your brain seeks and receives reward, is being forced to recalibrate. The neurons that once fired easily and often in response to sugar are now searching for a rhythm they've forgotten how to find. It feels like chaos because it is chaos, at least temporarily.
This is the window where most people quit. Not because they're weak, not because they lack discipline, but because they don't understand that what they're feeling isn't failure, it's progress. The discomfort is the proof that something real is changing, and if you can hold on through those brutal early days, something extraordinary begins to emerge. The brain, starved of its artificial dopamine source, starts to remember how to generate the chemical naturally. Slowly, tentatively, it begins producing dopamine in response to other things: morning light, physical movement, the satisfaction of finishing a task, a genuine laugh with someone you love. These rewards are quieter than sugar. They don't hit as hard or as fast, but they're real. And unlike sugar's spike and crash cycle, they last. There's an emotional dimension to all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. Dopamine isn't just a pleasure chemical. It's deeply involved in motivation, in mood, in your sense that life is worth engaging with. When dopamine is disrupted, things that once felt meaningful start to feel hollow. Hobbies lose their pull. Conversations feel effortful. You wake up in the morning without a particular reason to feel good, and you can't fully explain why. This stage, somewhere between day 5 and day 12 for most people, mimics low-grade depression. Not because you are depressed, but because your brain's reward architecture is operating below its normal baseline while it rebuilds. Researchers have found that this period of emotional flatness is actually a sign of healing. The brain is resetting its dopamine receptor sensitivity, slowly increasing its ability to feel genuine pleasure from genuine sources, rather than from chemical shortcuts.
Around day 10 to 14, something shifts. The cravings, still present, begin to lose some of their urgency. They don't disappear, but they change in character. Instead of a command, they become more like a suggestion. Instead of overwhelming, they become something you can watch from a slight distance. This is the beginning of what neuroscientists describe as receptor restoration. The dopamine receptors that were numbed by chronic sugar exposure are slowly waking back up. Meanwhile, your body has been running its own parallel transformation. The liver, which spent years processing excess glucose and converting it to stored fat, begins to clear that backlog. Insulin sensitivity, dulled by years of blood sugar spikes, starts to improve. Your cells become better at using the energy they receive, more efficient, less wasteful. The gut microbiome shifts in ways that matter profoundly to your mental state. The bacterial colonies that thrived on sugar begin to die off, replaced by strains that feed on fiber, on whole foods, on the nutrients your body actually needs. And since more than 90% of your serotonin, your primary mood-stabilizing neurotransmitter, is manufactured in the gut, this microbial shift has direct and measurable effects on how you feel. By the end of the first week, many people notice their afternoon energy crashes have softened. The fog is still there, but it's thinner. Sleep begins to improve, and underneath all the discomfort, like sunlight at the edge of a storm, there's something that feels like the first hint of clarity.
The second week brings its own particular challenge. The acute withdrawal symptoms have settled, but in their place comes a strange mental sluggishness, a sense that your brain is operating slightly below capacity. Glucose is the brain's primary fuel. It runs on it the way a car runs on gasoline.
When you remove the quick-hit glucose spikes that sugar provided, the brain is forced to find alternative pathways. It's not designed to do this quickly. The transition is gradual, and during it, you may feel cognitively slower than usual. Tasks that were simple feel labored. Words come slower. Your patience is shorter. This is the phase where people often make the mistake of interpreting adaptation as failure. The brain is not broken, it's restructuring. It's learning to draw on fat-derived energy sources called ketones, which burn cleaner and longer than glucose, but take time for the brain to learn to use efficiently. Think of it as upgrading your brain's fuel system. The installation is uncomfortable, the result is extraordinary.
Around day 15, neuroplasticity becomes visible, not literally, but in how you feel and function. Neural pathways that were once dominated by sugar-triggered signals begin to weaken from disuse. New pathways form. The brain starts associating reward, not with sweetness, but with the actual sources of well-being it was always designed to respond to: sleep, connection, movement, accomplishment. Brain imaging research has shown that individuals who abstain from sugar for several weeks show measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, impulse regulation, and long-range thinking. In practical terms, your willpower isn't just improving because you're practicing it. Your brain is physically restructuring to make it easier. The emotional volatility of the early days has largely settled by now. The highs and lows have leveled. Mood becomes more consistent, not because life has changed, but because the chemical chaos driving your emotional reactions has quieted. You begin to feel like yourself again, perhaps a version of yourself you haven't visited in a long time. Day 20 arrives, and with it something that surprises almost everyone who gets here: a lightness. A mental clarity so distinct that many people struggle to describe it without sounding hyperbolic. The fog is genuinely gone. Thinking feels faster. Memory feels sharper. Focus arrives without effort. This isn't wishful thinking or placebo. It's the measurable result of what scientists call cognitive restoration, the point at which your key neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, begin firing in synchrony again, no longer disrupted by the constant interference of blood sugar chaos.
The anxiety that quietly accompanied your life for years, the low hum of unease, the racing thoughts before sleep, the disproportionate reactions to small frustrations, begins to fade. Research from some of the world's leading neuroscience institutions has demonstrated that chronic sugar consumption rewires the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, amplifying its reactivity and making stress responses faster and harder to control. Remove the sugar, and that overactivated alarm system gradually recalibrates. You don't just feel calmer, you respond differently, with patience where there used to be irritation, with perspective where there used to be panic. Sleep deepens during this phase in ways that compound every other benefit. Sugar disrupts melatonin production and elevates cortisol, two hormones on opposite ends of the rest and alertness spectrum. Without sugar driving cortisol up at the wrong times and suppressing melatonin at night, your body rediscovers its natural sleep architecture. You fall asleep more easily. You stay asleep longer. You wake up feeling like the sleep actually did something. And because sleep is when the brain consolidates memory, repairs neural tissue, clears metabolic waste, and processes emotion, better sleep accelerates every other dimension of the transformation already underway.
By the third week, something unexpected begins to emerge in the space where anxiety used to live. A quiet, not numbness, actual peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from having solved all your problems, but from the absence of a chemical system constantly manufacturing distress. Social interactions that once felt draining become easier. Conversations flow more naturally. The mental overhead of managing your own internal noise drops significantly, and the energy that frees up is available for everything else. Entering the fourth week, the brain has begun to genuinely thrive. The fuel switch that started weeks ago has completed itself. Ketones, the molecules produced when your body metabolizes fat for energy, are now the brain's primary power source, and research confirms they are a superior fuel in multiple ways. They produce less oxidative stress. They support mitochondrial efficiency. They provide sustained, even energy rather than the volatile surges and crashes of glucose. People in this stage often report feeling mentally limitless in a way that sounds impossible until you've experienced it yourself. Waking up without needing stimulants, sustaining deep focus for hours without the usual mid-morning or mid-afternoon collapse, thinking clearly through problems that would previously have exhausted you. Memory improves in measurable ways during this final stretch. Names, dates, details that used to slip away stay accessible. Tasks that felt cognitively heavy now flow. This is not coincidence. High sugar intake has been shown to impair the hippocampus, the brain's center for learning and memory formation, through a combination of inflammation, insulin resistance, and structural damage to neural tissue. The hippocampus is also one of the regions most affected in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. Without sugar driving chronic inflammation through your brain, neurons communicate more efficiently. Synaptic plasticity, your brain's ability to form, strengthen, and reorganize connections, increases significantly. The noise inside your head quiets. The signal gets through. Creativity, which many people don't expect to change, begins to bloom in this fourth week in ways that feel almost uncanny. With the brain no longer constantly managing the aftermath of sugar spikes and crashes, cognitive resources that were previously consumed by that internal maintenance become available for connection making, imagination, and divergent thinking. Ideas that seemed unrelated begin to link. Solutions to problems that felt intractable start to surface. Writers find their sentences again. Artists rediscover their eye. Thinkers find that their thoughts, for once, go somewhere. And then comes day 30.
You've done it. 30 days without sugar. Your brain is different, measurably, structurally, chemically different from the organ you started with. The neural pathways that once made sugar feel necessary have weakened significantly. The reward system has recalibrated to respond to genuine pleasures rather than manufactured ones. The prefrontal cortex is stronger. The amygdala is calmer. The hippocampus is healing. You are, in the most literal sense of the word, not quite the same person who woke up 30 days ago and decided to try this. Then someone puts a piece of cake in front of you. And here's what surprises people most, more than the clarity, more than the energy, more even than the emotional stability. When you take that first bite of sugar after 30 days, it doesn't feel like a reward. It feels like too much. The sweetness is sharp, almost aggressive. The dopamine surge your brain once welcomed now lands differently, chaotic, unsteady, like turning the volume up too loud in a quiet room. What once felt like comfort now feels artificial. This moment is deeply instructive. It shows you in real time that the pleasure sugar gave you was never genuine satisfaction. It was a simulation of satisfaction, a chemical shortcut that bypassed your brain's natural reward circuitry and wrote directly to the pleasure center. Remove it long enough, and the brain's own intelligence begins to see through the illusion.
Some people, standing at this threshold, choose to return to sugar. The brain remembers the high. Old pathways, though weakened, still exist. That's not weakness, it's neuroscience. But now there's a difference. Now you have contrast. You have the memory of 30 days of genuine clarity against a lifetime of chemical noise, and the comparison is not subtle. The choice, for many people, becomes less of a struggle and more of a preference. You've tasted what your brain feels like without the interference. And once you've experienced that, the idea of going back to the fog feels less like a treat and more like a step backward. There's a larger truth underneath all of this that science is only beginning to articulate clearly. Sugar doesn't just affect your waistline or your teeth or your energy levels. It reshapes who you are. the way you make decisions, the way you respond to stress, the way you feel about your own life. Because all of those things are downstream of brain chemistry, and brain chemistry is downstream of what you feed it, day after day, year after year. The addiction isn't a metaphor. Functional MRI imaging reveals activation patterns in sugar consumers that are essentially identical to those observed in substance dependence. The withdrawal is real. The tolerance is real. The craving is real. The only differences between sugar addiction and drug addiction are cultural. One is sold in every school cafeteria and celebrated at every birthday party, while the other is treated as a public health crisis.
Which raises a question worth sitting with. If the mechanism is the same, if the neural hijacking is real, if the withdrawal is measurable, if the long-term damage to mood and memory and cognition is documented, then what are we doing about it? Is the answer regulation, education, personal responsibility? There isn't a clean answer, but there is a starting point. Understanding. Not fear, not morality. Understanding. Knowing what sugar actually does inside the organ that determines everything about your experience of being alive. Because here is the truth that 30 days without sugar eventually reveals to almost everyone who gets there. The energy you were chasing in sweet food was always already inside you. The happiness you were trying to borrow from dopamine spikes was always available through slower, realer sources. The comfort you were seeking in sugar was a loan with an interest rate that rose every year, quietly, invisibly, until the cost was something you'd never agreed to pay. 30 days. That's how long it takes for the brain to begin, not finish, but begin to undo the conditioning of years. To remember what it feels like to run clean. To stop confusing chemical stimulation with genuine well-being. To rediscover focus and patience, and the kind of quiet happiness that doesn't require a spike to exist. In the first painful days, you learn something about endurance. In the fog of the middle weeks, you learn something about trust, trusting a process that didn't yet feel like it was working. And in the final week, when clarity arrived not as a dramatic moment, but as a gentle settling, you learned the most important thing of all. That your brain, given the chance, knows exactly how to heal itself. That the capacity for focus, for peace, for genuine joy was never gone. It was simply buried under years of noise. Remove the noise, and what's left is you, clearer, steadier, and sharper than you've been in years. Not because you suffered, but because you finally gave your most important organ what it needed most. Not sugar, space.